Hi, this is Ing Venning, and I'm doing another post for Conscious Mosaic. I want to look today at DuckTales, the Disney animated series that aired from 1987 to 1990, and which was adapted by Carl Barks Comics. So this is another of Disney's appropriated stories. So I think arguably the main protagonist here is Scrooge McDuck. I think DuckTales shows us Disney's worldview, and I think Scrooge McDuck in this worldview stands in for Disney itself. Let's start by looking at his name. It's Muckduck. So even though you can't necessarily tell what race a duck is, he's associated with Western world culture in the sense that Muck or Mac is something you find in Scottish surnames. So he's associated with the UK. And then Scrooge uh, is the name of a character from Dickens' A Christmas Carol. And I'm not going to do a whole long post on it today or long explanation, but I think if you look at Scrooge in a Christmas Carol, it's a story of how at first he is greedy and hateful to people. And I think by the end of the story, he's reformed somewhat, but he isn't willing to change the system he's part of. His reform is essentially in terms of him understanding that he needs a public relations campaign. So attending Christmas parties, helping Tiny Tim, buying turkeys and presents for people. This is, like I said, he doesn't change the fundamental system. He still stays a wealthy banker, but he engages in public relations campaigns. And I think this is similar to what happens in the history of Disney because at first Disney did a lot of really overtly racist stuff. The anti-Semitic Big Bad Wolf, Dumbo, the Siamese cats. There were a lot. Song of the South was overtly racism. That was kind of like the Disney company saying we hate these members of other cultures. But I think by the time you got into the 80s and 90s, Disney was realizing we shouldn't be doing that. It makes more sense financially to actually appropriate that otherness, appropriate those cultures. But what happens is you have a lot of characters that are really Western world cultures, and they're just dressed up as foreigners. So, like in Mulan or Pocahontas or Aladdin or something like that, these are basically Western world characters that Disney has, literally drawn foreign features on. In the DuckTales world, Scrooge McDuck is the richest duck possible. And I think he also realizes he needs that PR. He knows that he needs the physical capital, but that he also needs to rely on human capital. I don't think he sees relying on other people or other creatures, but he sees it as human capital, which I think is how Disney, sees the people that work for it and the people that buy its products and things like that. Now, if we look at the nephews, I think the nephews stand in for Disney's chief audience of young people. And notice we have Huey, Dewey, and Louie. So their names are essentially the same except for those initial phonemes. And they're always dressed in identical shirts except the colors are different. So I think that this stands in for the way that Disney sees kids. It wants to box them in with alleged decisions that they can make, but those decisions are pre-chosen, like the colors of the shirts. And then the kids get to feel like they've made an important decision, but that important decision is boxed in by the Disney company so that, for instance, seditious decisions are not being made. The decisions that are being made come straight from Disney's catalog or off the shelves of its stores. We also have Webby, and by the way, we don't even have three Webbies. We have Webby or Webigail. There's one of her. She wears pink. She's the girl. And so I think it shows that Disney sees females as even more limited, even though it's very much limiting the male characters, young people characters. It's also even more limiting the girl character in terms of color. Um, this may also be the way that Disney sees creative talent, like the different colors could stand in for different hues in a co-opted palette, because Disney also has this mentality where the business person side of things trumps the creative side of things, and Disney is again and again and exploiting creatives, stealing their work, not giving them the proper recognition, not paying them properly, and yet it relies for the creation of those things that it markets. It relies on creative input. The parent to the nephews is we Over and over again, Disney has stories with absentee parents or bumbling or fool parents. So in the case of Donald Duck, he's actually both. But within DuckTales, you hardly ever see him. He's an absentee parent. He's gone to join the military, so he is still part of that Western world militaristic conflict kind of mindset. But he's mostly gone. And I think Disney likes to do all these stories with absentee parents because it likes to be the company that steps in and takes over for these parents. To say that it doesn't really matter what your parents teach you, our culture is the most important. And having absentee parent stories is one of those ways to emphasize the Disney culture. If we look at Bettina Beakley, and she's hardly ever called Bettina. She's usually called Mrs. Beakley, so she's associated just with her surname and her tie to a husband that, so far as I'm aware, is not in the series. She does the women's jobs and cleans up after the kids, and I believe it's established, although I don't know if it's in the animated series or the comics, that she's doing this without pay, that she just gets room and board. So she's another, or she's an exploited worker in this case. Launchpad McQuack. Notice his name is Launchpad, so an object of his profession and his individual name are inseparable in that sense. And he is a bumbling fool. He is a kind of a guardian to the kids in a lot of cases. He takes care of them in a lot of cases, but he's one, when Disney doesn't do absentee parents, it very often does foolish parents or bumbling parents, and that's what Launchpad McQuack is. But that's interesting, and I think it really shows the way Disney sees working class persons because he is one of the main engines of the plot. So many of the DuckTales stories involve travel, and Launchpad facilitates that travel, but he's not really seen as important. He's seen as kind of a bumbling idiot, the way I think that more wealthy business people in Disney would see the creatives that work for them, or just anyone that does less well-paid jobs, like in their theme parks or distributing their movies or whatever that might be. So those are the main protagonists and the protagonist's allies. Before I talk about villains, I want to talk about a lot of the plots that happen in DuckTales. So the most common plot is focusing on guarding wealth, but even more often, it's accumulating new wealth. And what form does this wealth take? It's generally cultural treasures from other countries. Generally, they're not seen in terms of their cultural value, except maybe to say, look at me, look what I collected. But generally speaking, their cultural value is de-emphasized and their monetary value is emphasized. And these treasures are generally seen as unclaimed by the natives of those countries. Maybe the idea is those natives can't understand the monetary value, which, I think Disney sees as the greatest value. Maybe it's just that foreigners by Disney are not as seen as intelligent or having as much claim as others. But generally, that's what happens. They're going to capture these treasures from foreigners. Now, and the villains in the story are the ones that want to stop this cultural appropriation, or they are competing toward appropriation of those treasures, one or the other. Often the entities, the characters that are completely foreign are minor villains. They're not really seen as yet being worth co-opting. And they'll appear in one episode and then they'll be defeated and their treasure will be taken, and that's kind of the end of them. And I think this is Disney saying, people that are foreigners or that are truly foreigners that aren't really part of us, they're easily dismissed, and it's easy to take their cultural treasures and appropriate them for our goals. I think you see that in some of the movies that I mentioned earlier, and I think it's happening in DuckTales as well. The true villains, the recurring villains, are ones that are seen as worthwhile to compete with Disney, or Scrooge McDuck in this case. And why is that? Generally because they are rooted in the Western world, but also others. So it's this idea that even an adversary has to be somewhat of your own culture to be a worthy adversary. So whereas the minor villains, the true foreigners, are often easily dismissed, these recurring villains are ones that there's something, they're part of the Western world as well as part of another culture that isn't part of the Disney culture. So Beagle Boys come up again and again. And it's difficult to distinguish which Beagle Boy is which. They have all these B names and they kind of stand in and out for each other. They're this, really large, entangled family. They're generally seen as bumbling, and they're generally competing for wealth with McDuck, but they don't do it as successfully. So they're like companies that are competing with Disney that don't do as well in terms of the monetary. You know, they might be indie companies or they just might be smaller companies. The Beagle Boys are associated with prison and organized crime, so they are doing many of the same things that McDuck is doing. They're stealing stuff, but their theft is not considered legitimate in the way that Scrooge McDuck's wealth or theft is seen, of treasures is seen legitimate. So they're bad appropriators of other cultures, or they're just companies that are competing with Disney for the money that it wants. And then we have Magica de Spell. Now, it's said that she's from the slopes of Vesuvius, but she has a lot of sort of gypsy type of characters, which is one of the main ways that we see in Europe people that are both foreign and like us, right? They're part of our culture, but they're seen as maybe erosive to that culture, and gypsies often are seen that way. So she's both a Westerner and an other. And she's kind of a caricature of the witch or pagan in the Western world, like an allegedly erosive force to Western civilized culture. Sometimes she's also seen with Madame Mim, who is seen in a similar way as like a witch in the Western world. So she's another villain that is other but also familiar. And another that is other and also familiar is the main competitor for Scrooge McDuck, who is Flintheart Glomgold. And Flintheart is actually, I mean, he is basically Scrooge, except he doesn't have that public relations ideology. He's kind of like the pre-Ebenezer Scrooge of Dickens' novel. He doesn't realize that he needs to finesse people, that he needs to have public relations. So he's just kind of about going and taking stuff. He's the second richest duck, and he's competing with Scrooge, who is the richest. But one of the reasons he seems to be the richest is because Scrooge understands how to appropriate culture and how to appear benevolent, even if he's not. Flintheart Glomgold has he is South African. I don't know if he's born in South Africa or educated there, but he's associated with Africa. But once he came out of the Barks comic strips into the Disney animated series, they emphasized his Scottish ancestry. So both the familiar and the other is going on there. And so he is that Disney competitor that's kind of more successful than the Beagle Boys. But again, all those have some otherness as well as familiarity to them as well. Okay. So that's kind of my analysis of DuckTales. At some point, I will probably talk a little bit about Saving Mr. Banks, about Maleficent, and about some of the other examples of Disney culture, because I'm very interested in Disney culture and what it shows us about itself through its own stories. So I hope you enjoyed this. Please, please feel free to like and comment, and please also share and subscribe. And have a fantastic day, and I'll be back soon for another arts post.